Hello. In this video, I'd like to introduce the output_list.grg file. This file is common to each of the models in the L-Range modeling family, and in each case, it informs the tool about which surfaces a user would like to have written out to file, whether it's to a hard drive or to a cloud or what have you. Which surfaces? There are dozens and dozens of spatial data that are calculated each month for every cell in a landscape in these tools. And a user may not want to store all of those. And so you can tell the machine which you would like to have stored and which you'd like to skip. It's also used by both an exporting tool and a graphical user interface to learn about the contents of these files, how to decode them and display them or export them. This is the output_list.grg file, and it is lengthy, but it's regularly structured, so quite easy to understand, I hope. The specific entries may require a little more study. I won't go over all of them in great detail. They're summarized in supplemental material, part of Boone et al. 2018. They're summarized in a manual associated with the software. But I'll go over those that strike me and also the structure of the program or the file. Let me zoom in. And I think, again, we will sacrifice our outline to expand the real estate. And so you see, actually, the first 6 entries are not really model output. The first 2 might be considered so, the X location and Y location of every pixel in the landscape, but they're not very exciting. They're not provided as surfaces, but they are calculated within the software. And so you can see that we have this X location and Y location for every landscape cell, and it's something that I would look at to know that it was behaving appropriately, but I don't want to write it out every simulation. It's not that useful. And so you see the first column. Basically, after the first column, I don't anticipate users editing the information. Certainly can, but if you did, you'd have to harmonize it with the software, at least for some of the columns. But that first column is explicitly meant to be edited by users. You can turn on or off whatever entry you would like to have produced from the G-Range or L-Range software. So for example, you'll see that X location and Y location have a 0 in the first column. That turns off production of those layers. Later on, you see precipitation, maximum temperature, minimum temperature. They have 1s in the first column. That turns them on. That means that as precipitation is read in, you can see if it's being read in correctly and also interpret whether changes you see in vegetation, for example, are associated with a wet period or dry period. And so right now I'm outputting that information. So we can scroll to the right to explore layers. You can see an entry after the file name, which gives the number of layers for each month. And so I'll talk more about that entry when I speak of facets, just as a commonly used and more interesting file to talk about that entry. And if there is only one layer, we don't need to know what the layer types are, but if there's more than one layer, then we do. That's in the column that appears blank for the early entries. The last 2 entries are used by the graphical user interface. They're not used by the software directly, and these can be edited as appropriate, but they are used to provide an output, to provide a little status update as users click about in a graphical user interface to be reminded what the contents of a given file are. On the right, you can see a lengthier description of the meaning of each entry, and in the column to the left on the screen, you can see it provides units. So the first two are the position of pixels. The next entry is not really named to a modern term, but it is landscape units. The rangeland type is landscape units. And so it could be helpful to be able to know where those landscape units are in a graphical user interface so that you can click about and learn how the dynamics relate within a given landscape unit. Echoing weather data, as you can see, as I've talked about. Day length is turned off, but if you turned it back on, you'd see a smooth gradation for day length calculations. Heat accumulation is a measure used by ecologists that incorporates energy gained through a given time over many days or over a season or a year. And so there's a base cutoff that's used. And so it might be 0 degrees or it might be 4 degrees or 4.4 degrees Celsius. And it looks at the temperature above that, how much heat accumulates, energy accumulates to grow vegetation. A whole suite of entries associated with water. So we've got potential evapotranspiration, evaporation itself, the snow and snow liquid equivalents, runoff, ratio of water to PET, for example. The CO2 value is related to how CO2 concentrations affect the transpiration rates, leaching, relative water content, etc. All the way down to annual evapotranspiration. So here we have an actual estimate of evapotranspiration. The next entry, which I will move to the top or as close as I can get it, is facet cover. And so I'll speak more about the layers here. Facet, again, is the name that Dr. Kogenauer gave to herbs, shrubs, and trees in his savanna model. I've adopted it here. So when we speak of herbs, shrubs, and trees, we're talking about facets. And so when this file will be produced, and it is just that, it's called facet_cover.gof, and it's storing the facet cover, the proportion cover for herbs, shrubs, and trees. That means that every month, instead of one layer of binary data being written out to this file, 3 layers are. Easy enough. 1 for herbs, 1 for shrubs, 1 for trees. And so the 3 that you see in the third column is telling either a graphical user interface or the export software that there are indeed 3 layers there. And the facet is a label for those areas so that a user knows that those 3 facets are represented as layers in the file. And again, the export software knows as well. Bare cover, in contrast, is just a single value, the proportion bare cover, and so it's 1 layer. The software is tracking populations of vegetation within each cell, and so there are 6 populations that are tracked. That's herbs, herbs under shrubs, herbs under trees, shrubs, shrubs under trees, and trees. And so those are the 6 layers that you see. And you can see differences in the file sizes. For example, the total population file size will be 6 times larger than the bare cover file, for example, because it's got 6 times as much information. The next entry, proportion of annual and deciduous, actually mixes information in some way. Not very common in this software, but it does give the proportion of annuals versus perennials for herbaceous plants. And then for woody plants, the shrubs and trees, it gives the proportion of deciduous versus evergreen. You can see above ground live biomass, below ground live biomass. The herb, shrub, and tree biomass was added to the version of GRange that I'm using in this demonstration. It may not appear in the copy that you are accessing. Carbon estimates, root-shoot ratios, soil surface temperature, etc. Sand, silt, and clay are again as much echoing inputs as they are the production of new information. Again, it's something that I would look at to know that it's behaving reasonably and then might turn off. And indeed, you can see that it's turned off here. But it is a reminder that, so for example, for mineral nitrogen, field capacity, not mineral nitrogen, that's surface and soil, but field capacity, wilting point, sand, silt, clay, those are stored for 4 soil depths, 0 to 15 centimeters in the default application, 15 to 30, 30 to 45, and 45 to 60, but that's adjustable. You can change that. Any change of that nature, though, you would want to readjust the model, assess the model, make sure things were behaving reasonably before using the model in discovery, using it to address scientific questions. Total soil carbon, we have tree and shrub carbon and nitrogen quantities for 5 woody parts. So this is leaves, fine branches, fine roots, coarse branches, and coarse roots. 2 layers for carbon-nitrogen ratio, fast carbon soil. So these are for soil layers. The fast carbon, intermediate carbon, passive carbon used in decomposition from the Century model. More entries: below ground potential production, above ground total potential production. And these are all estimates of potential production that get modified based on a series of relationships. So we have effects of CO2 on production. We've got limits to production associated with nitrogen availability. And ultimately, these calculations yield a monthly net primary production. So in post-hoc analyses, I would typically sum, and do indeed sum, that net primary production to yield an annual estimate of primary production. Different effects on decomposition. The dead carbon available. So this is tracking dead fine root carbon, dead fine root nitrogen, etc. Standing dead, seeds, etc. Different facets. Now, some of this is a matter of efficiency. So there are some entries in G range and L range where the structure is kept consistent, even though it isn't necessarily as efficient as it could be in terms of storage. So, for example, you see an entry for dead coarse branch carbon, and it's got 3 facets: herbs, shrubs, and trees. But of course, herbs don't have coarse branches, and so that information will always be 0. But programmatically, it's most straightforward to maintain that same structure. There are lignin concentrations, litter, carbon and nitrogen. Phenology is an interesting entry. The plants in G range and L range move through 4 phenological stages associated with heat accumulation and then reset. So when you click on the phenology in the graphical user interface and click on some cells, you'll see kind of a sawtooth response as plants move through their 4 phenological stages and then are reset at the end of the year or at the end of the wet season or what have you. There are reports on carbon, the actual carbon and nitrogen stored in living material for roots and seeds and leaves, the branches, the roots. Nitrogen is tracked, respiration flows, leaf area indexes, both the indices for the leaf area itself and then an optimum leaf area. Carbon and nitrogen source sinks are tracked, and then there are results for fire severity, how much carbon is burned, how much nitrogen is burned, some responses for fertilization, and then lastly, some surfaces that report error counts. I'll talk about this in more detail in a separate video, but basically with thousands of pixels on a given landscape, I couldn't let an error in 1 pixel bring the model to a stop. And so instead, I track those errors and then reset them to a reasonable value and continue. This is the spatial response of those errors. And then a reminder at the bottom that you can turn on or off the first column, but other changes should be reconciled with the software or the graphical user interface.